In today's video, we are going to be discussing the static keyword in the part of the Apex programming language. My name is John Dillon, and on this YouTube channel we discuss all things related to Salesforce development. So let's just jump right in. To illustrate what the static keyword is used for, we're going to start with a trigger. We've got a very simple trigger on the lead object. And we have a trigger handler, which is where all of our logic is going to be. And we call it based on whether we're before insert, before update, after insert, or after update. So let's look at the trigger handler itself. Again, it's just got 4 parts, and it's not doing much except system out debugs. So before insert, before update, and after update. And you can see we've got a variable that is a member of the class, and it is the counter. So we're simply storing an integer, and then in all of these methods we simply print it out, and then we increment it by 1 using the increment operator. So let's just run it and see what we get. We're going to jump into some anonymous Apex. We create the lead and give it its required fields, first name, last name, company, and then we insert the lead, and let's see what we get from there. So we get our before insert, our counter is 0, and after insert, our counter is also 0. Now this might be a little surprising because when we look at the class, we think, oh, this counter is available on this object. Right? So when we're between calls, before insert and after insert, we would expect it to maybe increment. But the thing is, when we look back at the trigger itself that's calling this trigger executes individually on these different conditions. It's either before insert, or it's after insert, or it's before update, or it's after update. So each time this trigger is entered into, we create a new handler. And when we create this handler, the counter is going to be initialized to 0. So every time through, even though before insert and after insert are called on the same class, it's a different instance of the class. This where we call the constructor is going to happen at each stage, before insert, after insert, and the updates as well. Just to illustrate that, let's take a look at what happens when we do an update. And again, same thing. So each stage, before insert, before update, and after update, we are instantiating the outer class, so that counter is always being reset to 0. So when we increment it here, it's technically it's not doing anything because the next time we read it, it's brand new. So if for some reason we needed this counter to live longer than the instantiation of the class, we could make it static. This basically puts the counter in a way outside of the class, at least outside of the class instantiation. So now this counter more belongs to the class itself than to the instantiation of an individual object of this class. So let's see what we get now when we run that same anonymous Apex. So now the counter is remembered between these trips. It starts out as 0, we increment it in the before insert, so by the time we hit after insert, it's 1, 2, and 3. Now what do you think would happen if we were to call it again? Would we continue incrementing the counter? Now again, we start from 0 and we work our way on up. So here's one area where a static is a little different in the Apex language than it is in other languages, say Java. In Java, if we had done what we had just done, it would have continued. We only initialize it once, and it never gets initialized again, and it would continue to grow. But in Apex, it only lives for the transaction. So, for instance, here when we run anonymous Apex, all of this happens in one transaction. Therefore, we get one log file, and the static will get initialized to 0, and we'll count it on up. But once we run it again, we're again starting fresh. If you're familiar with the Java language, this is similar to thread. Was it thread local? I think is the term they use for variables that will last on a thread like a static, but then they get disposed of at the end of the thread. So, which makes sense in the Salesforce world because it's all multi-threaded, right? We've got lots of things coming in and out, and we don't want things hanging around. So one other aspect of static is we can actually access we can access this variable because I've made it public, but also we can access it straight off the class. We don't need to, normally to access something on the class, you need to make an instance of the class and then access it. And that's what we're doing here within the trigger. We create an instance of the lead trigger handler, and we store it in the handler variable. And here, from handler, we call before insert or before update. But if it's static, we don't need that. We can call it right on the class. For instance, if this were not static, this would not be legal. We would get an error. But because it's a static member, we can access it right off the class name. We don't have to call a constructor or instantiate the class. And in that case, we're starting with 5, works its way on up. So I hope that explains static, at least static variables. We didn't get into static methods. I'll save that for another day. If you have any questions on when to use a static, or and if there's anything that I missed that still has a mystery to you, feel free to ask in the comments and I'll be sure to answer. If you're jumping into Salesforce development, either if you've been doing it for a while or you're new to it, I encourage you to take my free assessment to gauge where you are and maybe what areas you might need to work on to if that's your long-term goal, is to get into Salesforce development. You can see the link in the description of this video, also at the bottom of the screen. If all the trigger code that we were looking at was a little confusing or maybe new to you, I encourage you to see my Hello World Apex trigger video right here, and that takes it right from the basics, and we'll give an explanation of a lot of the things we saw earlier in this video. I hope this helps, and I will see you next time.